All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 35 of The Artist Well. Just a few things before we start. Firstly, for those of you who saw last week's episode with the delightful Elizabeth Cope, the only woman who's ever left me completely speechless during an interview, much to everyone's amusement, and I hope hers, certainly mine, and after the event, she asked me to correct a couple of omissions. She neglected to mention her niece, Gillian Lawler, and Gillian's husband, Mark Cullen, who runs Palace Gallery in Dublin. And also to mention that the skeletons that she painted were in the natural history museums in both London and New York. The other museum she mentioned in Edinburgh, whose name escaped her, was called the Surgeons Museum, very aptly. If you missed Elizabeth's feature, you can catch it on The Artist Well on the YouTube channel. Now, the other thing is, this morning when I was out for a walk, I thought of how can I make The Artist Well a little more inclusive for everybody watching, so that everyone is involved. So it's not just questions and answers and looking at one particular artist. Yes, we're going to major on a particular artist, of course, but I did have the thought that we should really, get people involved, because we're all artists, either whether we're photographers, poets, painters, sculptors, anything. We've all got something that we're doing aside from this. And I thought it'd be a very nice idea to give a platform so that people can show their work, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm introducing a thing called Drawn from the Well. And each week I'm going to ask those who are viewing, all right, not everybody else, but only those who are viewing, to submit a recent work, something that they maybe completed during the week to me, and we'll show that. Now, this is not a competition. It is merely a platform to show your work. And as I say, it can be a photograph, it can be a poem, it can be a song, it can be anything at all. Just send it to me in advance and I'll put it up on PowerPoint or whatever's appropriate. And we'll show so that, you can share with your fellow artists what you're up to. And that's really the purpose of it. And I just think it'd be a nice addition, because I know there are some people out there who, if they're asked to feature on The Artist Well, they'd rather stick pins in their eyes and do so. So, we have to cater for everybody, and we want to cater for everybody. So please bear that in mind. I look forward to getting your submissions. As I say, it's not a competition, and I'm going to show everything. And it's up to you to kind of do a sort of little explainer with it, or whatever's required. But it is not a competition. It is merely a platform for us all to see the sort of work that our viewers are doing. And I think that's a nice idea. I hope you agree. Okay, so back to today's guest artist. He is an Irishman, and he's living in Belgium. From 1986 to 2015, he was Professor of Painting in the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp. As a result, he's fluent in Flemish, and in fact, he and his wife, Linda, whom he met over in Belgium, it's their first language. They speak Flemish at home as their first language. They have two children, Tara, who lives in the UK, and Aaron, who also lives in Belgium. So let's go straight over to Pat and say hello. I think there's a word in Flemish. It's called hello. Am I right?
Hello. Goeiedag.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. How are you?
Fine.
You're very welcome.
Surviving, working, so okay.
Say that again?
I'm surviving and I'm working.
That's the main thing.
Crazy situation we're in, and lucky to be able to do that, really. Yeah.
So listen, you're living there for many, many years, but you originally came from Dublin.
Came from Dublin, from Eccles Street.
Yes.
On the north side. And so grew up in Dublin, and then worked on the docks for a year after my secondary school.
Mm-hmm.
Port Services Limited, it was called, I think. As a clerk, I used to go and take a list of the people that were working on the ships, so that they could then be paid, because the companies didn't employ them directly. There was always somebody.
It was almost done every day, wasn't it?
It was done every day.
Yes.
Well, it was done every day, but mostly per ship. So if the ship took 2 days to unload, you'd be on the ship for 2 days. And I had to take a list and then see what's on.
This is as a teenager or something? Were you a teenager at that point?
I finished up secondary, so I would have been about 18 or something like that.
Okay, all right, yeah.
And during that year, I went to evening school in the NCAD. And after a year of that, I then went on to study full time in the NCAD. So I resigned my job in port service in Dublin Docks, and then was a full time student in the NCAD. Yeah.
And what sort of drew you into that area, Pat? Because we were talking during the week, and I thought it was quite interesting what you were saying about, you know, how people take various paths in their career, and you know, what sort of.
I think we're lucky, really. I think life presents possibilities. Without knowing the consequences, you make decisions.
Yes.
So you're sort of confronted with many crossroads, I think, as you go through life. And I remember at one stage, you know, maybe 2 or 3 groups of friends that didn't really have that much in common with each other.
Yes.
And at a certain stage, obviously, I made a decision to go in one direction. There were 4 of us from the north side. One of them, so I named them: Tony Murray, Tom Grace, Kevin Gill, and myself. And it was Tony and Kevin that were painting, making these terrible Salvador Dali surrealistic paintings, as everybody does when you're 18 and 19, while you're painting. And suddenly I realized this was a possibility with paint, you know. So we ended up painting in gouache and comparing them and talking about them. And then it was Tony that went into the NCAD as an evening student, and then we joined them. And then at the end of that year, we applied and we got into the NCAD. So whereas if I hadn't have chosen, you know, that opportunity arises, and then you think, okay, I can paint. Another opportunity could have arisen, like, you know, you can steal radios out of cars. You know, you might choose that, you know, not knowing the consequences, you know. So I think you make choices, and you grow in that fashion. And that's always been my case, really. So I ended up in the NCAD, and then you know, you happen to meet people that have an important impact on your life. Huh?
Yes, exactly. So when did the Antwerp connection come in? I think you won a scholarship, did you?
I did, yeah. So I finished up. I finished up in the NCAD for my diploma in 1977. Yeah. Then got a graduate year. Campbell Bruce was trying to organize a degree course. In order to do it, he wanted to create a 4th year in painting. Yes. To sort of form an argument for the Ministry of Education. So I got a postgraduate from Campbell, and then I got a scholarship between 77 and that scholarship and that postgraduate. I got a scholarship to Spain. So I went to Spain for 2 weeks to the Spanish. It was before Erasmus. These were just cultural exchanges between countries. And it allowed me to study Velázquez and Goya. And the marvelous thing about Goya is that you've got to see his work to understand the complexity of it. Velázquez, I could see in reproduction how rich his painting was and how important it was. But I didn't see that in Goya because his paintings are a little flatter in reproduction. So he was a revelation to me in the Prado. I used to spend my mornings studying Spanish and Spanish culture, and the afternoons I was free. The Prado opened at 4 in the afternoon after 7 in the evening. All right, yeah. In the summer because of the sun. And so I spent the afternoons in the Prado, and then when I came back, I had applied for a scholarship to go to Hamburg in Germany. But the Irish painter, there was an Irish painter on it at the time, and he got it extended. Yes. Which meant it wasn't available. And the librarian in the Academy of lovely man, he created, I think it's called Nibel, you know, this library in the NCAD that gathers catalogues and information about all the artists in Ireland. So he was just pinning up a poster to the door of the library. I was sort of disappointed that the German scholarship wasn't available, and he said, "Listen, this just came in. It's Antwerp. It's a port city. It's great. A lot of the Irish went there. You know, Roderick O'Connell went there. Paul went there. They used to go to Antwerp, and then they."
And what was the attraction about that, Pat? Why did they go to Antwerp as against, you know, Florence or?
The Academy in Antwerp had a great reputation. They could study painting in Antwerp, and then they would go off down to Paris, and mostly study them in private areas and schools in Paris, but then also paint landscape. But in Antwerp, it was the Royal Academy of Fine Art that had a huge reputation in the 19th century, and that went up until the Second World War changed a lot of focus and moved art to New York. But up until, you know, the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of artists had gone to Antwerp and then down to Paris. And a story about it. So I was in a bedsit in Antwerp. And at that time, I used to get letters on a Saturday morning. And there was a Baroque museum, the Rockhouse in the Kaiserstraat in Antwerp, that had just been restored by the Credit Bank. They also have branches in Ireland, I think, the Credit Bank or the Credit Bank. It's a Flemish bank, and it was beautiful, but it was empty. I used to go in on a Saturday morning. They played Baroque music. They had the courtyard furnishings from the Baroque period. Also, Jacob Jordan's painting, small Rubens sketch. There were lovely things to see, and there was nobody there. I'd read my letters from my family. I'd reply. It was such a wonderful thing to be able to do. And then some years later, Julian Campbell curated an exhibition for the National Gallery called the Irish Impressionists, about this phenomenon, about the Irish that went to Antwerp in the 19th century and then went down further into France. I discovered that the Rockhouse House used to be what they would call a herberg, so a cafe and lodgings, and most of the Irish painters had lodged there. That's where they lived when they were in the Academy in Antwerp. So I figured they were still there because I felt very at home in this courtyard, and I used to read letters from Ireland. I'd write letters back. So I think their ghosts are still hanging around there. There's no beer anymore. It's a museum, but I think it's still there.
Yes. And how did you transition from being effectively a student to professor of painting in the Royal Academy in Antwerp?
Yeah, that's where my path with those marvelous Irish painters that went to Antwerp and then went on to France differs. I ended up staying on in Antwerp. I met Linda, my wife. She's a printmaker. We met her in the print center and then in the Academy in Antwerp. I then in 1986 I was offered a job as professor of painting in the Academy.
I mean, that was phenomenal. But can I ask you, before you actually got that job, presumably you were doing a few odd jobs to keep your head above water when you were a student? Yeah,
so when I finished up as a postgraduate course in the Higher Institute in the Academy in Antwerp, an MA course, when I finished that up, it was in 1981.
Yeah.
I had known Linda from 1980, and at that stage, a lot of people were leaving Ireland. The economy was quite bad. I wasn't really that concerned so much with that, because in that postgraduate year in the NCD, I got a job teaching life drawing in Parnell Square in the pattern and design. So I could have returned to that, but you're young you want to learn things, and Antwerp offered many possibilities, you know, also just within a few hours being able to go to Amsterdam, Cologne, used to go to Paris for a day to see exhibitions and come back.
Yes, yes.
So it gave all of those opportunities that I needed to develop my work. So I was sort of very hungry, and looking at patents is an amazing way of discovering things. So I could look at a lot of things.
You were very well situated there, but you had a few strange jobs, didn't you, while you were trying to
So I finished up in 81, and having decided we wanted to stay, at that stage the borders weren't open in Europe as they are now. So I needed to prove I had an income in order to stay.
Yes.
And a friend of Linda's father had a printers. They were specialized in printing perfume bottles. At the time, a lot of these perfume bottles, they were like cola bottles now, where the text is printed onto the glass.
Yeah.
So it wasn't stuck on. So you had all of these people in the day printing these sometimes very tiny perfume bottles. And then I did the night shift, and I was alone.
Yeah.
And it was on what do you call these things?
Conveyor belt.
A conveyor belt. So in the middle you had an oven, and that was synchronized with the temperature. That was behind the door that was locked, so I couldn't fiddle with the temperature. So the speed of the conveyor belt related to the temperature. So what does that mean? That means if you tried to slow down the conveyor belt, the bottles would melt.
Yes.
So I worked there alone, and I had about 1.5 meters of space before it went into the oven. So I would have to make sure that was full.
Yes.
At the end of the conveyor belt. And at the other side, I had 1.5 meters that I had to pack in the boxes.
Yeah.
So that had to be empty, and the other side had to be full.
Yes.
And then I had about maybe 5-10 minutes at the most, maybe even less, to stuff a sandwich in my gullet and drink tea, and then see all the time these bottles reaching the end of the conveyor belt that were going to fall off.
And the end of your job.
Yeah, see the other side that was getting emptier and emptier, and you weren't allowed to have a void. So if nothing went into the conveyor, into the oven, the temperature would drop, and the ink wouldn't be baked.
Yeah.
But I remember one night about 3 a.m, these were on pallets, and you can imagine these very small bottles. So I don't know, I think coming from the north side, I'd probably say there were gillions of perfume bottles on this pallet. And moving my boxes that I had already packed, I bumped into this, and they went everywhere. And these were all the bottles I had to print. I had to bake.
Yes.
So I wasn't sacked, but I had to call the boss because I didn't know how to cope with this. The oven was on the thing. There was nobody. So
it must have been really weird, you know, being on your own like that throughout the entire night.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Did it help your art at the time?
No, so as a lot of people of that age, so I'm young, I had this idea that, you know, this is great. I work at night and I paint in the day. You know, I can sleep for a few hours, I'll be fine, you know.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work out like that, you know.
No.
He ended up having a collapsed lung at the end of the year, and had to give up that job.
Yes.
Because the combination sounds great, you know, I can work at night, I can paint in the day, but it doesn't work out like that. So I stopped. But then I was lucky. I was then offered a job in an evening school teaching watercolor, and that gave an income, be it small, but it gave me an income to prove. They were called the foreign police, the Vreemdelingenpolitie police.
Oh.
They had to give you a sort of a paper every 3 or 6 months that you had to have in your possession, which meant that you were a legal immigrant.
Yes.
And luckily in Europe is that all gone now. it's pity for the Brexit because they'll discover this. But for young people, it's great to be able to travel now and to choose. I want to stay in Germany for a while. I want to stay in France, and not. We forget very quickly what it was like prior to that. You know, that wasn't. I met a few buskers one night when I was in Antwerp in that first year. So that's 1978 into 79 was my first year in the academy. And periodically they would be transported over the border into Holland because at the time in Belgium had
run out. Yeah. And
the police knew they'd be back in 2 days, but they had to do it. So this sort of agreement with them, they were picked up, they were transported to the Dutch border, and they'd be put over the border, and the police would just say, "Don't come back on Saturday," and they'd go back. So it wasn't great animosity between them. It was just like it was their job to go around the streets now and ask people, "Where's your papers?" and then to say, "You shouldn't be here," you know. Put them on the border, and they'd see them next week busking again, but that was okay. Huh?
Yes, interesting. Yeah. Okay, listen. Let's have a wee look at your studio, can we?
Yeah. Okay. Give it a while for. Okay.
Yeah,
so
that's good. That's
okay.
good.
So
just raise it a wee bit.
Yeah, I can see it. So these are my brushes. My studio isn't exactly sort of terribly neat, but I've cleaned it up, so it's reasonable. So the paint I use Michael Harding and Old Holland.
Yes.
Both paints that have a lot of pigments, so there's a lot of pigment in it. The color is very strong. They're also expensive. I use large tubes.
And do you ever use acrylic?
I don't. No.
You don't, okay.
I do. I use acrylic, and I'll show you later.
Yeah.
Just to put a tone on my canvas.
Oh yes. Yeah, because it dries quickly.
Yeah, I'll show you that when I go down there.
Just tell us the name of the oils again.
The oils I use Michael Harding.
Yeah.
And Old Holland.
Okay. And what about your brushes? There's a nice set of brushes there.
Yeah. So these are brushes I discovered recently. You know, sort of in the lockdown, you end up not being able to shop in your local shops, and these are rosemary brushes. They're made in England, and so when I bought them, ordered them first, I knew they had a good reputation, but using them as I have, and the way I'm fairly sort of, the paintings often look very sort of serene and quiet, but they're made with a lot of aggression and brutality in a certain sense, putting paint down, scraping it away. So the brushes also get a hard life. They're standing up to it, so they're good brushes. They use good quality hog's hair, and they don't tend to lose. All brushes lose a few hairs in the beginning. These also, but less. You know, in that period when I had to order online, I had other brushes. Twice I was terribly the first time I couldn't do anything with them at all. The hairs were just coming out all the time, and the second one were okay for the price, but they were still losing hair, and these have stood up. And so I use filbert, but in the lockdown, I think through a sort of a longing to see people, and my loved ones, and my son, he lives in Antwerp, and my daughter lives in England. You said earlier I live in Belgium, but in fact I share my time between the two. So I was in Ireland, I couldn't see Aaron, he was in Antwerp.
Yes.
And I ended up resurrecting a portrait I had started from him, of him some years ago. He came to pose for Father's Day or something like that some years ago. And I hadn't worked on a portrait for many years, so that portrait ended up being lost among many canvases in the studio. But I dug it out last year and I started working on it. And I did that, I think, because I needed to reassert the human presence, I think.
Yes.
And also I think, wanting to see my son and not being able to see him. But why am I telling you that now? Because these are round brushes.
Yes.
And for some strange reason, I felt I wasn't able to do exactly what I wanted to do with the filbert. So the portraiture demanded a different approach.
Sure, yeah.
I ended up ordering, also from Rosemary then, a whole set of round brushes. And for the portrait, I used mostly round brushes.
Yes.
For the portrait of Aaron. So
and that portrait we'll see later on when we're showing images of your work. Yeah.
I use both of those.
Yeah.
I'll show you. I'll walk very slowly.
Yeah.
Before I show you the canvas that I'm now working on, I'll show you how these things start. So
yes.
This would be the tone. It's a sort of a burnt umber walk down, and it's roughly the sort of tone that but my palette becomes sort of fairly, somebody said recently, you know, I burn this all off once a year, but it still seems to increase. And recently somebody told me they're starting to look like the stags of Broadhaven. And that's something that I paint a lot, you know.
Yeah.
So
it looks like a piece of sculpture you could sell.
Well, I'll work on it, you know. It's increasing with the day.
It's lovely, yeah, great.
So this is a painting I've just started. And a family member is ill in Canada, and even within the lockdown, we felt we had to go and visit. And during that time, I made some watercolors, and I'll show you also shortly. And this painting I'm starting, so in fact, it's a hill in Canada. And the thing about Canada is that's different than where I am in the west of Ireland, is that they've got all of these trees. And this tree, and you get used to being able to see distances.
Yes.
And this tree, you know, there were times if I had a chainsaw, this tree would have come down, you know. So you're looking and you just want to see that distance, and this tree was in the middle. But now I'm going to incorporate it into a painting.
Yes.
Of a hill with this tree. So like everything, because of it, sort of things happen, and you see things that you wouldn't have seen. And then here, you'll see all sorts of things that I pin up. This is in various small catalogues that I've published, you know, with Taylor Galleries in Dublin or elsewhere. I've been able to use poems from Seamus Heaney, Dermot Healy, different people. And this is a call that I used in one of those.
Yes.
And this is so I read poetry when I don't know what to do with my painting. This is Midterm Break. That's a beautiful poem by Seamus Heaney. And then, unfortunately, when I'm working and then don't know what to do and start reading poetry is very close to painting.
Yes.
It's also layered and full of metaphors, and you've got to read a poem sometimes 100 times before you realize what it's about. But unfortunately, they end up being full of paint. That's a book by Peter Fallon. I told them that I felt a bit sort of embarrassed.
So I get the sense that poetry is your sort of go-to for inspiration as against music or something like
that? Both. Music, I play a lot in the studio. I play classical music, and I've got these sort of obsessions. At the moment, I'm playing for a good while now the cello suites, Bach cello suites of about 8 or 9 different recordings from Pablo Casals that recorded in 1936 or something like that, to a more recent Belgium cellist that recorded a couple of years ago, Vivian Spanoga. And they all play it differently. So every time it turns into something else. And I find it's very meditative music. It's repetitive in a certain sense.
Yes, yes. And Pat, are you painting a lot more now that you're sort of, I know you're not retired, but you're retired from the professorship in
2015. I stopped teaching.
Yeah.
it was because well, I would have had to do a few years longer. So you get penalized when you stop. But anyway, the more you paint, and I think all painters, I would imagine, would agree with that. The more you paint, the less you know. You know, you could find that frightening because you realize that it's not like, you know, you can learn how to dig a hole quickly, maybe, and depending on the soil, you know what to do every time. But that's not like with painting. Is different. With painting, every time you've got to reinvent how you're going to paint this thing. So I ended up having so many doubts. I had more doubts than solutions, and I decided that it wasn't fair to be bringing my doubts to the students, but at least that it was time to try to bring my doubts to my own studio.
Yes.
And to work out. So doubt and consideration, I suppose, are very much part of my work. I think it's painting is like that. You know, you move things around.
Sure.
Over them, you scrape them away, but I think the things you've painted that you've scraped away, they somehow still contribute to the final image.
And to what degree is your work premeditated, or is it something that is inspired as you work?
It's very much the latter. The only premeditation is walking the fields of Mayo, making small watercolors. The watercolors then trigger moments when I go back into the studio. I'll show you some of the watercolors, and you'll see they're very sort of simple, but they're about light and about space. If I walk too quickly, let me know.
Yeah, no, just raise the camera a wee bit so that we can get a better view. Yeah, that's better.
So this is a series of watercolors I made in Canada.
Yes.
They're about, some of them. So we were in quarantine for 2 weeks, and then in the afternoons we were visiting Linda's sister. I would make then some watercolors from the balcony where we were, and then when we got there, I also made some watercolors of where she lives. This is one of them. So these are sort of more moments in time, you know, being there, small notes, more or less.
Yes, yes.
About what I'm looking at. The thing about doing this when you're in that landscape is that it makes you look more closely. You know, you spend time just sort of being there, also with your thoughts, and not being anywhere else. Because of the nature of the visit, this also helped me anyway get through it.
Yeah. And Pat, how would you describe your style of work? You know, I mean, if one was to compare, say, with Martin, whom I know you know very well.
Yeah.
You know, Martin is very realistic, highly detailed. It's almost as if you draw the essence of the image rather than the image. Does that make sense, or?
Well, in a way, I was talking to Martin recently, and while there are a couple of things we share. So we both work with the landscape, but I suppose for me anyway, one of the most wonderful things we share is the friendship we had with Sean McSweeney.
Yes.
I remember when he passed away, from out our different corners of the world, we wrote on, you know, this thing online,
RIP.ie, yeah. Yes.
I remember Martin wrote something that really said everything, because it was so simple. He just said, I think he was the nicest man I ever met. Martin might correct me when he's unmuted, but I think it was that, you know. I think he was the nicest man I ever met.
Yeah.
Or I think he was probably the nicest man I ever met. So why am I telling you this? So Sean, and this is something I only discovered recently from Martin. Sean and Martin lived for many years close to each other in Wicklow.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, Martin wasn't really that concerned with the landscape, with figures and things, but living in the landscape as Sean was. And Sean worked in this is how Martin told me, how I remember with my grey brains that probably deteriorating with today. But anyway, Sean would return from work where he was working in a garage. I understood from Martin that they were working on chassis about cars and doing all, getting the engines out and then painting them. So that'd be Sean's side. By the way, my father was also a coach painter. Maybe the color comes from his eye, because even though he didn't know anything about painting, wasn't concerned, there was no artistic activities in my family, except his love of John McCormick. But besides that, no visual activities. But his sense of color was quite sharp, and he would use it. You know, our door was painted with the many shades of green of CIE, with paint that was smuggled out. And every year, the painters that worked in the hotel opposite us would then knock on our door, and my father, they would ask, was it sprayed or how it was painted? My father always said to me, if they come, Lovey, he used to call me Lovey, if they come, Lovey, just tell them, if they ask you how it's done, say elbow grease. Now, I'm only a little fella, and this guy knocks at the door in his white overalls full of paint, and he says, you know, who painted your door? And I said, my father. And he said, and how did he paint that, you know? And I said, elbow grease. He said, smart little fecker. I didn't realize what I was saying.
Of course, yes. Very good.
Sean was telling that. So Martin told me he used to drop in some canvases to Martin on the way that he had prepared with the paint from that garage. So he got off a stop or two earlier from the bus, and he'd drop a few canvases in to Martin, and then they'd both work on these, and then they'd come together some evenings until early hours of the morning, I think, talking about painting. And I think the common sort of factor in our lives, Martin, as it was with Sean and other people, is a love of painting.
Yes.
And everybody sort of finds their own way, you know, how you work with a landscape, what your concerns are, will differ from painter to painter. Martin works with very elaborate, very well thought out compositions that he will sort of arrange things, move things around.
Yes.
I understand from his work, looking at it, he'll do a lot of these things in sketches prior to
That's right. Yes.
They tend to know less. I used to work with the single image when I was working on portraits many years ago, and then with a single rock, a single hill. You know, I was very much concerned with the single image.
Yes.
And now of late, in the last years, because I can share my time in Mayo, because I can be there much longer, that I can walk there, I tend not to be as concerned anymore with the urgency of getting that moment down on canvas. It's more the totality of the landscape that has inspired me in the last years. And that, when I say that, I mean the space.
Yes.
Space around rocks, the space through fields.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's fascinating is that, you know, you can get two artists and they will look at the same landscape.
Yeah.
And it's chalk and cheese, you know, it's completely different. That's the lovely thing about it.
Yeah. And then they will make two paintings that are totally different.
Yeah.
That's what's marvelous about it. An old colleague in Antwerp once said to me, do you know, there's no competition between painters, because painters make unique work, unique for them.
Yes.
To more or less create their own marketplace for their work, which will be different than my work and different than your work. And that's what's fascinating, but also marvelous. Yes. When I came to Antwerp, I came on a scholarship that was I got the scholarship, and I was lucky to get it 3 years in a row, so I could get the MA. It was double. So the Troubles were still on in the north of Ireland. So you had two communities, the Protestant and the Catholic community in the north of Ireland, the Nationalists and the Unionists. In the 17th century, you had Rubens and Rembrandt living so close in time and place to each other, but making paintings that were so different. You know, Rembrandt working for what they call the koopliederen, so private collectors, business people, paintings that had to be made for that context. So they were smaller. They had to fit in domestic settings. Rubens is making these huge paintings for churches. His main patron is the Catholic Church. So he's working within that context. They're both sort of amazing painters. They're just so incredible. You bring two of those paintings together, be it two portraits from them, and you'll see something totally different. And they're working at the same time. They're working often with similar, you know, if you take it superficially similar, they're making figurative works. But Rembrandt is making mostly individual portraits because that's what he's asked to do. So you get within that context, you get totally different paintings. And my scholarship was about those. Belgium was on the border of the two cultures. It was literally created more or less because of that. You know, you've got France and Spain and the Catholic influence there. And then from the Belgian border with Holland, you've got Calvinism. So Belgium was always sort of a little sausage in between to keep the others away at that time when it was created. Yes. So I wanted to sort of try to figure out how could Rubens and Rembrandt be so close in time and place and still work so differently. And I correlated that to the Troubles in north of Ireland. That might have been clever of me, I think it was, because of that I got the scholarship, because of course in Europe and in Belgium they found that interesting. And also because they know they're on the border, and also because even Belgium is made up of two cultures that working together, and two very different cultures. So I've always been fascinated with how things can influence.
Okay, Pat, I think what we'll do is we'll go on to look at some of your paintings, because I want to leave enough time for questions, okay? And we're heading very closely to 11 o'clock already. So if you wouldn't mind going through the paintings very quickly, if that's all right.
I'm going to...
No, you don't need to do anything.
I'm just going to show you, because I was talking about how the difference between how you build up paintings, and I don't sort of start with very worked out compositions of sketches. I know what I'm doing. You know, I've got watercolors, I've got drawings, I've got photographs. I know what I want to do. But once I start painting it, they change. And I've been incorporating whereas I used to sort of more or less try to paint away or cover the history of the painting. I've now allowed it to integrate into the image. The final image, in fact, is smaller than the surface of the canvas. So what you're looking at here are the layers that went before the final decision. And they can sometimes be very different. Sometimes they can be very different to what eventually this ended up. You know, you had some sort of blue areas there. You end up with a sort of the Stags of Broadhaven in the distance. No, sorry, the Achill in the distance. Where I'm looking across from my studio in Mayo, from the front garden that looks out across a bay. To Achill. And this one here was a sunset with the Stags of Broadhaven, and the poor Stags of Broadhaven are still there somewhere in the surface, but they have been fairly sort of drastically integrated into the final decisions of that painter. I think you then eliminate things. Also had a very sort of blue sea area, but it's about a sunset, and the area that was warm and pink started to increase, and I allowed it to increase. So I think while everybody approaches it differently, I think I tend to see where the painting will go, and I often go to places where I wasn't able to see in the distance, wouldn't have been able to see it.
I know. So we're going to go into the presentation, and we're going to start with a portrait of yourself. I'm just going to bring that into full screen. Can you see that now?
I can only see my name.
That's all you're meant to see.
I can't see the portrait, I mean.
Oh, sorry, now, yeah.
Now I can. Yeah.
So this is an early work of yours, isn't it?
Yeah, so that was made in that first year, in the first semester. I remember working on this. I had to get a bus to Brussels airport from Antwerp, and I'd been working on this portrait, not in the academy itself, but I did this in the weekends. So I was in the academy from Monday to Friday. I had my own personal studio, which was great. The academy was closed on the weekends, and then I'd work at home in the student accommodation I had found, a bedsit sort of place. And I was working on this portrait, and I remember getting up early on that morning and working on it. I'm working on it until I just had to drop everything and make a run for the bus. And then that whole Christmas, I was sort of thinking, is that right? Should I have moved that around? Should I have gotten rid of this? And so it's from that first, it's from 1978. It finished up in December, and then I got a bus. When I came back in January, I left it as it was,
And presumably, and stating the obvious, that the canvas is there on the left-hand side and you're looking at a mirror.
Yeah. You're seeing the reflection of the canvas, huh?
Exactly. Yeah,
and
it's a lovely portrait.
Sort of a novel mirror. But even at that stage, so above, you see sort of a shadow at the top of the black frame. That was some sort of wrought iron decoration.
Oh, right,
yeah. Also part of the painting, but in the end I found it didn't work. I had to make it softer, had to shove it back into the space.
Yes.
So even then I was sort of I was eliminating things and changing things, And I was working at that stage on portraits and on nudes. And this would have been one of my last nudes, part of that period would have been, I'm speaking over sort of a year or two, where my interest started moving to the landscape. So we had moved from Antwerp to Tilrode. It's a small village, about a half an hour from Antwerp, close to a river. And our daughter Tara was born, and I used to bring her to a childminder, and I'd walk along the river in the mornings. And I taught at that stage in the academy in Antwerp. I was professor of painting at that stage, and I, a few days in the academy, and then the rest of it was in the studio. And Linda was also teaching. So when we wanted to work in our studios for home, I'd go to this childminder, but walking the river started to have a huge impact on me. So I ended up slowly, the nudes became recliner nudes, became closer and closer to the landscape. And then as that went on, the landscapes started to appear, I started to make landscapes.
Yeah, okay.
And on that river. And this is a painting, so I'm not so sure exactly of the year. I think it might be 1997. Anyway, I did a project around.
Sorry. Yeah, go on.
I did a project around shell craters in the West Hook of Flanders, in the west of Flanders. In the First World War, there were a lot of that whole area was devastated. The war went on for 4 years. You see all these photographs of trees, And then as time goes on, the trees are just stumps. And you can imagine armies just being there in trenches for 4 years. That whole landscape is saturated with that time, really. So when I went and worked there, we got the opportunity to stay in accommodation there and work. And at the end of it, there was an exhibition, that sort of thing. Linda worked on the same project as I did. And the marvelous thing about these shell craters is that they've now, nature has sort of taken them over, and they've become beautiful pools. And even one of them, a very big one, is called Pool of Peace. And this is a small one. They're dotted along that landscape, and they're scars from the First World War, but they've become very serene and very beautiful.
Yes.
Pools. And I did a whole series of painting those pools, and I used poetry, as I mentioned, in catalogues, and I had asked Seamus Heaney for permission to use one of his poems in a catalogue. And I sent images, including this image. And I got a postcard back that I still have here, very proud to have it, where he says, from bog pools to polders or shell craters, we go far to come home. So I think when I worked with the Flemish landscape, it was also very much about sort of pools and that sort of thing. And that's why I was attracted to these shell craters, I think.
Yes.
This one that's now up on your screen is the bay, in fact, that they brought that gas pipe through into Rossport that created all of that problem in that area in Rossport. But it's a beautiful bay, and you're looking across in the distance, you see Achill. So I painted that a number of times, and this is one of those paintings. It's a very quiet, beautiful area. You know, you get this beautiful serene bay. You've got Klingad, the sort of a headline. Then the distance to your right, you can see Belmullet and Achill further. So it's hard to envisage, really. I think I made a series of those paintings, really, more or less to visually reassert the beauty of this place and the importance of it.
Yes.
Because in the papers, you were only getting the news about Shell and the need for this gas and putting this in, but nobody was really sort of saying, you know, the devastation that was going on in this area, which is a very beautiful, and they had approached it in a very sort of arrogant way, which meant that a lot of the locals that didn't want this pipe going across their land, slightly rejected. But it's that bay that the pipe goes under. Are you looking at that one? So a couple of years ago, and I was talking to somebody recently from that. I discovered this area by getting a fellowship to Ballinglen in Ballycastle, Ballinglen Arts Foundation. And I was talking to somebody recently that was also one of the fellows, and he was talking about a moment that he was out in Carrotaic where I spend most of my time now when I'm in Ireland, in that area. It's about 40 minutes from Ballycastle. And he said he didn't want to go back that evening. He had to go back for the dinner that Margot Dolan, the founder of the Ballinglen Arts Foundation, had put on for some of the artists. And he said the sunset was so beautiful that he said, he's American, he's very sort of rough in his language. He said, I figured, what will I say when I go back? How will I speak? How will I sit on the chair looking at this sunset? So he wanted to say, we always had the same problem. I used to work out there all day. The afternoon, I go and collect Linda and our two children. We go out, we spend the rest of the afternoon. I'd still paint with watercolors and things. And often, you know, this most beautiful time was the evening. And then we'd have to head back. Tara and Aaron, our children, used to complain that our time for dinner was always 10 in the evening. It was quite exhausting, but they survived it.
Yes.
And this sunset, I've painted a number of sunsets of late, maybe with the lockdown, you want more sunsets than you used to have. But my work is always about paint as well.
Yeah.
The sunset then has to be translated into marks on the canvas. It's really what can then happen when somehow you try to paint space and time and color and try to equate that with paint and with. So the rays of the sun became very tangible. They became fairly thick paint, and the reflection of them also in that way. This is an island for a painter, but I've got to say something about this. So our mutual friend Sean McSweeney died on the 2nd of June in 2018. I couldn't make it to the funeral. For some reason that I've forgotten in the meantime, it was impossible. So on the date of his funeral was a Monday. Would have been on the 4th of June. I went into the studio, and I think it's the only time of late that I made a painting in one day. I figured if I can't go to his funeral, I go and I make a painting thinking of him. And it was the only time of late, as I said, that I was able to complete it in a day, but that's what I intended to do.
Yes.
And just so it's called Island for a Painter, but it's very much about Sean. That was very important to me, as to many other people.
Lovely. Very
okay,
good.
flip.
Okay, flip.
Yeah, that's a sunset also in the, and that's the Stags of Broadhaven. And that's also the Stags of Broadhaven. So Aosdána. This is also very much a lockdown painting. I worked on flowers, and they became very quiet. And the spaces between the flowers have become very important.
Yes.
Because of the silence of the lockdown.
Yes.
This is also one of them. This is called, this was a series of paintings that should have been shown in London last year, April, but the show was postponed and postponed and postponed. And it was called, the show was going to be called Pigments and Other Doubts. So it's very much about how paintings are built up, scraped away. That's the term pentimenti is Italian for, in fact, for mourning. But it also, in painting, it's about changes that painters have made in their paintings. And with time, they become visible. As paint becomes transparent with time. And this whole series was about time and about changes and about doubt and about pentimenti. So that was the title of it. And it will still happen. But the gallery in London is in lockdown as well, so we'll see.
Okay.
I draw also with charcoal, and I draw as I paint. It's a fairly sort of brutal and aggressive activity in lots of ways. So what you're seeing at the bottom of that is the dust from the charcoal. That is part of the reflection of that. That's a rock in the water, a stack in the water.
Yes.
But the language of drawing was how you make marks, how charcoal can make marks, and how it's built up. Is also part of the subject matter in that drawing.
It's a lovely medium, I must say.
Yeah, charcoal.
Yeah. Okay, and then this one is of Aaron.
This is my son. So this is the paint I dug up that I had started a few years before this madness could be even thought possible.
Yeah.
And wanting, I think, to see him and not being able to see him. And other people and loved ones, I decided, I think I just not decided how much I needed to paint the portrait on. So because I had started this a while and I had something to continue on, so it's called Portrait of an Art Lover, because he works in a gallery, and outside that all his time is spent visiting exhibitions, and he's very much about that. And that's why I got that title. But it was a difficult time. It was difficult painting to make because I hadn't worked on a portrait for more than 30 years. you've got to rethink everything. And as I said, I even ordered brown brushes because I felt the marks I wanted to make, I couldn't make them with the filbert. So this painting had many different lives and many different layers, and eventually was concluded in the summer in Mayo, and then submitted to the annual that was also postponed a while, but eventually opened in December of last year for a few weeks.
Catherine Gagan says, "Hi Pat, have you ever painted the docks? They've changed so much with containerization. It'll be good to see them as they used to be."
Well, I did, but I painted them as they would be. One of my first paintings as sort of your own personal work as a student in the NCAD, in my first and my second year, when a new system came in with Campbell Bruce and your own work became central, was based on drawings I had made of what I used to call the giant's chair. So as I grew up in Dublin, I used to go to Dollymount around that area, and there was this big yellow chair, and in fact it was a crane, and the vertical part then lowers down above a container ship, and there's somebody in a little box up there, and he organizes the crane, and they lift up the containers and they bring them onto the dock, they put them down. So the painting I made of the docks was of what I used to call the giant's chair. As a child, I always was fascinated with this thing. And as it turns out, it was probably at that time only one. And now there are many, of course, and little different, but essentially they're the same. So I painted it as a container dock.
Yeah. Margie Dunn says, thanks for that, Catherine. Margie Dunn asks, what binder do you use with the pigments?
So the binder, in fact, is already in. That's oil, pigment and oil in oil paint. And then as medium, I use standile and white spirit. I used to use turpentine. But when I went into the house, Linda said I smelled like a bottle of turps. And as a child, my father used to come home from the spray booth from CAE, and he always kept a sandwich for me, which I loved dearly because it tasted like he smelt. So he used to bring his sandwiches into the paint booth, and they got a pint of milk to take the poison away. So from a child, I was always eating these sandwiches that smelt of paint. So they couldn't be healthy, but I'm still here. But I stopped using turps because of it, because it's bad for your lungs.
Of course.
So I now use white spirit, and the oil I use is standile. It's a heavy form of linseed oil. It doesn't yellow any more than it is at the initial stage.
Very good. Thanks for that. Owen says, amazing palette. Yes, indeed it is. Yvonne says, I like the early self-portrait. Eileen McDermott Rose says, wonderful portrait, so expressive. Brigine Butler says, I'd love to let it roll on. The images and stories are so engaging. I know, Brigine, I'd love to too, but you know, I mean, these things could go on for 2 or 3 or 4 hours if you let them. Bernadette Kiley says, very nice portrait, Pat. Catherine, I can understand your need to paint Aaron. He's the image of his father. Just definite likeness there. Owen McLaughlin, such a tender portrait of your son. Olivier Cornet, love the fluidity of your work.
Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. Barbara Fitzgerald, does Pat remember painting a lemon?
I did, yeah.
There's one for you.
For a while, I painted small objects.
Yes.
There's also a story behind, because Charlie Brady arrived into an exhibition that I had. And it was an exhibition that he was supposed to have. I had taken his time slot because he had the calcium. Charlie was then very much advanced in his cancer illness.
Yes.
And he was in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And so I decided, I met him then in Buswells with Pat Taylor and Charlie and myself at his request. few days after the opening. And he turned up at my opening, which was amazing. He was quite ill. So I decided I was going to make him a painting and give it to him before he died. And that was a difficult job because I'd been working on huge, big paintings. And I wanted to paint him a pear, because that's what he used to paint, pears and things. And it took months. And I eventually got a pear, but by the time I got it, he had passed away. I painted a couple. I gave the pear then to Desmond McCavick, which was the best man at his wedding.
Yes.
And I painted two. I gave the other one to Pat Taylor as a remembrance of that evening. And then it brought me in, like I said earlier, sometimes you encounter things and they bring you into different areas. Suddenly it shifted my work into small still lifes for a few years.
All right.
There's sort of a homage.
Yes.
And then I ended up being interested in that format, and I ended up making a series of lemons and small. Yeah.
Very good. Thanks for that, Barbara. Brigitte says, when do you decide that a painting is finished?
It's very, very difficult. I remember Francis Bacon being asked the same question, and he replied, when Marlborough Fine Art come and collect it. Unfortunately, they never come and collect my paintings. So I tend to continue and change and continue. I think I stop when I figure I just can't bring them any further, and I move on to a new canvas. Picasso said you paint the same painting your whole life, really, in different guises. And I think that might be true. I think we move from one canvas to another as actors move from one podium to another, one stage to another.
Yes.
Do
you work on several paintings at a time, or would you stick with one painting?
Yeah, I sometimes work on a couple at the same time. Not several, but maybe two or three. Yeah. Because sometimes I need to dry.
Okay. Gary Robinson says, love this work. Do you feel that there's a spirituality to your work?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think it's not so much about specific places anymore. It's about the totality, and that includes time and space and transience.
Yes.
All those elements are also part of spiritual concerns, I think. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Thanks, Gary. Tim Goulding says, there's a buttery poetry in the work. Love the pale flowers and their space. A Giacometti-like exploration. Oh, this exploration in the work and related to what Pat says about doubt.
Yeah.
Or your thing jumped there because another comment comes in. So yeah. Did you get that?
I missed a bit, but it's okay.
There's a buttery poetry in the work.
That was Tim,
Pale flowers in their space. A Giacometti-like exploration in the work and related to what Pat says about doubt.
Yeah, but I think when I worked a lot on figures in my early work, Giacometti would have been one of my inspirations. And also, there's a marvelous book. It's a portrait. It's a record of a portrait that Giacometti made of an American journalist, I think.
Yes.
I can't think of his name at the moment. I think it might be Short, but I'm not so sure. But anyway, he comes and poses for Giacometti every day, and Giacometti changes the portrait, works on it every day, and the whole time the conversation between them is often recorded. And Giacometti is constantly saying, it's terrible. I can't do anything, I can't paint, I'll never get this done, and that sort of thing. And they have this marvelous conversation, and Giacometti builds up this painting, and if you see his paintings, literally in the end, the nose is often like exaggerated a little, but it might be maybe a centimeter higher than the rest or something. Really, literally almost builds them up in paint.
Yes.
And constantly in that book complains about his incapacity to paint. He finds it an unbelievable, difficult language that he can't really command. But it's it's a small little book, you know. It's beautiful with reproduction.
I hope he'll forgive me for mispronouncing his name. Rupert Warren says, if I understand you correctly, you paint in Mayo and Antwerp. Do you notice a difference in the work you do? All of your work is very delicate and considerate. So in other words, do you notice that the work you do in Mayo is quite different to the work you do in Belgium, Antwerp?
No, and it's not. And I think it's not because it would have been where it's still concerned with the specific moments, specific moments of space and of time. But it has evolved to being about the totality of a landscape. And more, and this is maybe also because of this terrible virus and because of the lockdown and because of what we're all going through, not being able to see our loved ones, our friends, and how we have to rearrange our life this week. Even if, as artists, you can cope because you still have your work in your studio, so we're lucky.
Yeah.
But because of that, I think longing has become an important part of my work. But I realize that longing has always been, in a certain sense, a part of painting as such, because in fact, when you start out on a painting, you really know what you don't want. You're rejecting the whole time. You know, you put things down, you reevaluate them, you consider, you paint them away, you scrape them away, you rearrange, depending on how you work. So what are you doing? I think you're longing. There's something hidden in the distance, behind the veil or behind the mist. And it's that you want to get. So it's not, you know it's there and you can almost see it. So with the paint, you've got to pull it out. So it's a sort of a longing to make that thing visible.
Yes.
And I think that longing has taken on all sorts of different forms now in this pandemic. But I think it's always part of work. And I think now, because of how my work has evolved, and because we're now in this terrible situation with the pandemic, I think longing is one of doubt and longing are the main themes, maybe. And because of that, the specific place is only a part of what's going on. Yes. It's your perception of where you are and what you're trying to see and what you're trying to comprehend. That's become more and more important.
Yeah.
And that in itself is also about longing. So if you're in Paris or in New York or in Antwerp or in Mayo, I think it'll be about the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very, very well put. Two others now. Catherine O'Neill says, "I loved the painting you did in remembrance of Sean McSweeney, a philosopher in addition to a painter. Very interesting presentation. Thanks, Pat and Alan." And David Goldberg says, "David Bomberg said he tried to get at the essence of a subject. This is what Pat seems to be looking for." Yeah, well, that's what I was sort of saying as well. He finds it. Yeah.
Yeah. I some years ago, David Bomberg, an amazing painter, and I organized, when I was still teaching the Academy in Antwerp, I organized a trip to Tate Britain in London. There was a Hockney show on, and also then the permanent collection there in National Gallery were always on our agenda. And after going around the Hockney show with the students, I then dispersed and I start looking around. And in another area, I remembered it as being going down the stairs and into these other rooms in the Tate Britain and discovering David Bomberg. So that was an exhibition as a rediscovery. He had been forgotten for many, many years. And this show brought his work together. And Tamsin Hudson had made the book. And he was relaunched, he was rediscovered. He was Frank Auerbach's teacher, as many other students. And I think a lot of the students that were successful then wanted him recognized as well and help in his resurrection from out the dark corners.
Yes.
So David is right. I think Bomberg has also been an influence on his way of working also. Certainly his later work, and it was that later work that meant that he was shown, because before that he was successful abstract painting.
Mm-hmm.
He went figurative at a time that wasn't really acceptable.
Yes.
And he fell out of the art market.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I do ask my guest artists is if they had the opportunity to beg, borrow, or steal a fabulous work of art or a piece of sculpture or whatever to adorn their walls at home. In your case, what would it be?
It would be, as between us, you well know, as many other people would know, they know me, it's a Rembrandt, Marguerite de Geer. In 1977, I had finished up the main course in the NCAD.
Mm-hmm.
And between that and the postgraduate, I spent some days in London, as I had done prior to that many times. And I walked into the Rembrandt room, as I also had done many times prior to that. But it was like I walked into it for the first time in my life, and this full-length portrait of Marguerite de Geer that Rembrandt made hit me like, it was like being hit by Joe Frazier, or I was sort of completely stunned. Yes. And I spent the whole day in front of this painting. And it's the only time ever in my life that I cried in front of a painting. And I think it was because I discovered what I couldn't do. It was more or less sort of an emotion that came, but I realized I'd finished up the diploma year with egg tempera and very fine sort of paintings. And I was looking for something else because I was starting to use a bit of texture with the egg tempera. And this painting of Marguerite de Geer showed me what paint could do, what oil paint could do, or what I wanted to do, but couldn't do. Yep. And it had a huge effect on me. I ended up doing a whole series of portraits based on the same size of this canvas. So if there's any painting I could sort of steal and live with, it would be this painting. Yeah, I think the whole sort of possibility of paint and what paint is capable of is in this painting, in our hands, in our face. And every time I go to London, she's become a sort of a friend. I always go and visit, and every time I do, I discover something new in our face or in our hand. Or it's a most beautiful painting. Yeah.
All right, Pat, thank you so much. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the program, and I hope you enjoyed it too. But it's been a tremendous insight into your artistic career and indeed your personal life too. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for asking me. And thank you for the people that got up early to talk to us.
We've had people ranging from Germany to Canada and Texas even.
Oh yeah.
So we're spread far and wide.
That's good.
Bernadette Kiley says, thanks so much, Pat. Keep well. Thanks, Pat and Alan. Very exciting, says Bridget.
Well too.
Yeah. So look, we'll end it there. Thanks again. Now, for those of you who are listening to this or watching it on YouTube, if you liked it, please give it a like and do subscribe, because it gives us plenty of bragging rights with other artists to try and attract people of the quality of Pat and so on. So please do subscribe and all of that. So thanks again, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next Saturday when we will have yet another artist. And same time, 10 o'clock. Look forward to seeing you then. Cheerio, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming.